Thank you for coming. So the subject for today is something I've been thinking on and off about for many years, really. Work and play. And in French, the word for work is travail, which translates to toil. And then they have a word for employee. And then for artwork, they have oeuvre. And in English, it's all work. So we have like a blanket word for all those things. And we don't even think about it. You want to see my work. You don't mean my travail, my toil. And these things kind of come up. I think most artists, a lot of you are artists, we come across this in the most mundane, everyday way. I went to the dentist just last week, and it's about a block away from where I live, and the receptionist who I have never met before, she said, "Aren't you the person whose hobby is painting?" And I said, "Well, it's not really a hobby." And so she said, "Well, it's a profession then." And I said, "Yes," because I just wanted the conversation to end. But the truth is, in the sense of a profession, like being a doctor or a lawyer or even an architect, it doesn't fit well as a profession either, because luckily I'm a professor, so the word professor and profession kind of come from the same root. But the point is I've been painting since I was a child, really, and I had no thought when I was 12 or 13 that it was going to be a career. That came later. And of course, as a career, it's pretty questionable, I can't live on it. And none of the painters that I know, including several famous painters, are able to really pay their day-to-day bills strictly on sales. So I don't think I know a painter who didn't teach, including some who are quite famous and well-known. And I don't mean just Milton, but Jack Tworkov and Paul Resica, people like that. They've all taught because they need that stable income. So there's that aspect of it. It's not a hobby, and it's not a job either. You're kind of in this twilight place. Now, Pat kind of got me thinking about this because at one point, about 15 years ago, she was kind of working on a student's painting, and she had made a few strokes, and Pat was very good at this. She could kind of do 2 or 3 quick things, and the painting would just come alive. And the student was delighted and perplexed. She said, "Well, I see what you did, but I have no idea what you did. And what is art? Can you explain art to me? Because I have no idea what's involved here." And Pat said, "I'll get back to you." And that night she called me up and she said, "I'm in a bind because the student really wants a one-sentence definition of art, and I need a little help." And so I said, "Well, I'll get back to you." And I was thinking about it, and what I came up with, which she used, and it's actually in her journal down there, in her little book. It's a kind of a convoluted sentence, but I think it touches the basics, which is that it's a species of play, or a type of play, and the purpose of which is the creation of forms that need not serve any function other than revelation. So it's a little convoluted sentence, and her first objection was the word play, that it's a species of play. She says, "Well, play sounds like fun. It's not fun." And I said, "Well, play isn't necessarily fun, because play can be very, very serious when you're engaged in it. And moreover, there's work that sometimes is very pleasant. I mean, people have jobs sometimes that they like very much, and they like going to work, and they like the office, and they like the people they're working with, and they don't see it as..." But if you say to them, "Oh, would you come here and work without a salary, for free?" they look at you like you're crazy. So that's, whereas if you're a painter like me, you're working all the time, whether it's monetary or not. It's simply something that you've always done, and you don't, in a way, know how not to do it. without getting very, very depressed. So there you go. And then there was this question of revelation, which is like, well, what are you revealing exactly? Well, at one point, what you were revealing was quite literal. So if you're thinking of the Epiphany, before James Joyce got a hold of the word, it meant the Christ child and the divinity of the Christ child, which is apparent. And so if you were a painter 5 centuries ago, you would try to do something with the little baby that would make it look like it was divine. So you would create rays, perhaps, emanating from the child. And if you were a little more sophisticated as a painter a century or two later, you would make a glow, if you can create that glow feeling. But it was basically a literal way of illustrating or depicting the concept of the divinity. Later on, when you get to someone like Delacroix and he's talking about the sublime, how do you reveal the sublime? So he would come up with a metaphor. And he'd say, well, there's this beautiful old oak, and it's called the Oak of Antin, or Antin. It's 5 centuries old. Nobody knows how old it is, and it's all by itself on a hill. And if you look at it in the distance, it's by itself, and it's this magnificent trunk with a lollipop, very symmetrical leaves. And you say, that's beautiful. That's just beautiful. He said, but if you go up to the oak and you lay against it on your back and you look up at the branches emanating above you, and you can't see the shape of it anymore, and it's just this gigantic, massive pouring out of, and it's almost terrifying. He says, well, that's the sublime. You see? So he was very distinctly different about the difference between beauty and the sublime. So that's a revelation also. But it's more of a metaphorical, it's not a literal thing like trying to put a glow around a baby. But it's something that is in a way a more sophisticated, more poetic kind of revelation. So revelation could be anything, really. That's why I didn't go any further than that. So I said it was a species of play rather than work. That's the way I've always felt about it. And in that regard, I want to read you 2 or 3 little short excerpts from Jack Twarkov's journals. He had private journals, and they were all printed. And the thing about Jack is I knew him. I was his monitor in Cooper Union, his class monitor. And Jack was trying to impress upon us, we were seniors in the undergraduate school, about what it meant to be a professional painter. And, what you needed to do. And I didn't like almost anything about the way he was describing it to me. And I don't want to get into it in depth other than the fact that you had to kind of find a theme, a painting that would be a seed, and then you would make different variations on that. And so you would have a coherent show so that people would have the idea of what you were doing, basically. You were trying to be intelligible to people. We're talking about abstract art here, to people who aren't that familiar with abstraction, but they could see, oh yes, this is a version of that, and this is a version of that, and it would be, right. So I was kind of surprised, and it was kind of interesting reading his private journals. At this time, in 1977, he had lost Leo Castelli as a dealer, who was probably, at that time, the most prestigious dealer in New York. And he was with Nancy Hoffman, who was basically across the street. And he's writing to his sister, Janice Biala, who is also a well-known painter. My main problem this summer has been my desire to cut a new departure in my work, and so far reaping nothing but frustration. The real obstacle has been the habit that I've formed of, quote, producing, unquote, making pictures with the gallery and exhibitions in the back of my mind. In spite of having told Nancy Hoffman that I will not exhibit new work again until I've worked out the change I have hoped for, the habit is too strong. I cannot really play in the studio. Before I know it, I'm at work at another picture, in quotes, not unlike the ones I've just finished. And that's in August. And then 3 months later, in October, although I'm pleased with the changes in the last few paintings, I'm still too much involved in making pictures. I'm still not sufficiently in the frame of mind where the free play in the studio takes precedence over any possible result. I still have too much on my mind the need to, quote, produce. I have to overcome any sense of guilt or anxiety when my time in the studio is not necessarily productive, when what I make are mere throwaways. And only that, meaning the throwaways, will I raise myself to some new level of seeing. And then finally, and this gets to this idea of the professional and everything that goes with it, you know, the idea of making money and having fame and having some standing in the world, a niche, you know, a social niche in the structure instead of just being this kind of outsider. Again and again, I'm introduced to people as, quote, the famous artist. If a small part of it is true, I cannot understand how this corresponds with the low esteem of critics and museums and my own feeling of disappointment in my career. It's as if there were two people, a public man of some renown and another man in utter obscurity. Also, I'm puzzled. Which do I really want? Do I really want to be a public man, or do I subconsciously seek by every means to escape into privacy? Neither role gives me any joy, and I don't know what the answer is to my question. So I just thought that would be a very good way of kind of getting into these kinds of questions. From my point of view, as a student of his and being like 20 years old, it was very nice to be in the class of this prestigious, well-known painter who's shown in all the museums. And he didn't communicate any of that to the students. All of that is private thinking. What he was interested in inculcating in the students was the sense of professionalism and how to get a career and how to make yourself intelligible to people who don't know what you're doing, which is very important. But what he's really seeking is to be a little bit more like me. He wants to play in the studio. And he wants to see what he can come up with. But he's got shows coming up and he can't afford to be non-productive. And that's what's ripping him into two people. He says, I'm two people, right? I'm the man, the public man with the gallery, and then there's the man who wants to escape into the person who just goes into the studio. You know. Now, from that, I would like to get into the word. I want to end this talk with Duchamp. I hope I can get to it. So Pat's idea that the word play is suspect because it brings to mind the idea of fun. And of course, then my countering that with that play can be very, very serious when you're engaged with it. And then the word play and everything that goes along with it. It's not just playing a game. You could be playing an instrument. You could be playing somebody for a fool. You could be playing a role in a drama, or you could be playing a role in real life. You could be playing for time. And then even putting people away, you could talk about the free play of light on a Formica surface, right? Because light plays too. So play is a multi-dimensional word, more multi-dimensional than work is, I think. Now, one of the things that gave me some structure when I was thinking about the word like play is a book that I read a couple of, decades ago called Homo Ludens, which is Latin for man who plays. And in it, he had a chapter on art, which I thought was really terrible. But earlier in the book, when he's just talking about the concept, what would define play as opposed to the rest of your life, he had, I think, some very cogent things that would encapsulate the idea of play. The first was that it has to be voluntary. So if you enter into it because you're being asked to do it or made to do it, it's no longer play. And of course, coupled with that is that if you're doing it as your livelihood, then it's no longer really play. Two is that play is limited in time and space. So when you're engaged in the activity, it doesn't bleed into everything. It's like a certain time when you're going to do this. That doesn't mean you may not think about what you're doing when you're away. You know, you could think about your artwork, or if you're a baseball player, you may be thinking about about your hitting while you're going to the grocery store. I mean, you know, you may be thinking about it. But when you're engaged in it, it is a special time. And in this special time and place, special rules apply. And the rules, or you can use the word conventions if the word rules bothers you. Now, these rules may be rules that you've adopted for yourself, or there may be conventions that you adhere to that come from the culture that you were born in and raised in. Or they may be rules that you've created in contrast to the culture, specifically to deny the culture's hold on you. But they only apply within that time and space. And outside of it, you're back to being a regular person. Now, these rules can change, including the culture's rules. That it's not something that is constant for all centuries. But when it changes, the game changes also. So the game is not exactly the same game when the rules change. And to put it in like the most obvious, mundane sense, again, I refer to sports, the designated hitter in baseball, you know, the idea that there's going to be somebody the pitcher never gets to bat because pitchers can't hit, so you're just going to have somebody who can hit and you never have to worry about replacing the pitcher. Well, that changes the game. It no longer becomes a strategic game anymore because the idea of replacing the pitcher is fraught with many, many questions that the manager has to think about. He has to think about how good his relief pitchers are. He has to think about how many men are on base. He has to think about how good the hitter the pitcher is, because some of these pitchers can hit better. And he has 5 or 6 different variables that he's running through his head when he decides. And everybody in the stands who knows anything about that sport is thinking right along with the manager. Should we take this guy out or not? If you take that away, you've changed the game. Still, you can call it baseball. I mean, the word, you're not going to change the name, but the activity has been altered. And you see these things, of course, with art very much. That the word art or painting stays the same, and yet the rules are malleable. They're not written in stone. We're not painting the way we did even 100 years ago, much less. Finally, 2 more. The suspension of reality. That when you're engaged in a game, that becomes your reality for that period that you're engaged in it. And those special rules are part of that special reality that you're engaged with. And to some extent, there's also a suspension of your individuality. You know, when you're a player. You know, and at that moment, it becomes really important. And you can see these, you know, 150 years ago, rugby in northern England was something that was done on festival days after the spring planting. And there'd be a rugby game or something like that, some sort of football match between 2 neighboring villages. And everybody we're going to destroy them. They've been thinking about this game for months. And of course, once the game's over, it's back to your life. And you may even have a beer with these people. And, you know, now you eat. Now is the feast time. This is long before professional sports existed. It was something and the Olympic Games in ancient Greece were sacred festivals at certain times of the year. So there was always a ritual aspect to that. And I'll get back to the connection between play and ritual in a minute. So the suspension of reality for an alternate, limited reality. The reality of the church service, for instance, when you walk into a place of worship. And then the release from that when you come back outside and you're back with the traffic and everything else. And finally, and this is the most important thing about play, suspension of the control of the results. So if you know you're going to win, you won't play the game. Because it's of no interest if you know what the results will be. So for it to be a game, for it to be play, the results have to be up in the air. And then it becomes interesting. I think that's what Jack Torkov was talking about when he's saying, I'm producing and I'm not playing, and what I want to do is play. I don't want to know what the results may. He calls them throwaway. You know, I'm going to end up with throwaways, but I need those throwaways to go someplace. That idea of suspending control of the results was something that Resnick, for instance, that was his absolute feeling about art. Make sure you don't know what you're doing. That was the way he would put it. Don't look where your foot is about to land. And above all, don't take a step into a footprint that's already there. You need a virgin footprint in virgin snow, not fitting your foot to footsteps, because that's going to change the way you walk. Then you have to be careful. Now, you can see that a lot of the things that are in this little list that I just made also extend to ritual activity. Limitation in time and space, rules, special rules that apply within the framework of the ritual. And I don't think they all apply. The suspension of identity, I think, does apply to some extent. You're part of the flock when you go into a church or a synagogue. And of course, the use of ritual tools, I think there's all kinds of techniques and tools that apply to rituals, which also apply to the arts that we engage in. Some people find it important to break free of the ritual tool, which in a painting would be a brush, and try something different. The brush is a very good tool because it not only releases the paint, but it holds the paint. So you can release it with the way that you touch the canvas, whether you want to release a lot of it or a little of it. And of course, so the brush is really good in that respect. But there are people who want to move away from it, and I can understand that too. Somebody who poured paint for almost 2 years, I understand that. Now, ritual is essentially magic. It's the magical part of religion. It's designed really to raise your adrenaline, to get you worked up, largely by means of connecting with the spirit world, and the spirit world means also your ancestors. So, for instance, you would use incantation. Now, incantation sounds like magic, right? Abracadabra, which is an incantation. But it's also the use of antique languages. So if you're Catholic, it would be Latin. So the idea is you don't have to actually know what the Latin means, but you have to intone it, and that creates the mood. It's like connecting with your Catholicism. And Hebrew forms the same function for Jews. It's the language of your ancestors, And also the repetition, which creates the mood and gets people into the moment. And that is the way magic generally works. It's quite literal in most of it. That's really the difference between magic and art, is that art works by means of metaphor, where there's magic goes right for the thing itself. The statue of a saint 5 centuries ago was the saint. It wasn't the image of the saint. It was the saint. So I wanted to read you something here. Also very short. This is from this 25-volume set of Encyclopedia Universale dell'Arte. I have all 25 volumes or so. And they have articles on artists and also on, you can find out the art of Indonesia, for instance, from this book, whereas, where are you going to find that now? Although maybe with Google, maybe you can. And one of the articles is Art and Magic. And it's written by Mario Busagli. So this is what he says about art and magic. So long as the magical belief operates, the artistic products are subservient to the magical action and the techniques. But after the magical belief has been superseded, the techniques and the products remain, but the identification with the original meaning is lost or weakened. The symbol that had magic power has now been transmuted into an emblem, and romantic poetry changes images and moods of magic and wonder into mere fictional fantasy, into the poetry of as if, eliminating the element of fear and creating a sort of a game. So we're back to games and play there. In the long run, magical powers are not abolished, but sublimated in various ways. The magical experience survives in the secret miracle of artistic creation. The preservation of words such as magical, miraculous, and enchanting are now used as an aesthetic response, and that preserves the magical connection. And to those words, I would also add charming, charm, bewitching, and raptured, or rapt. These are all words that originally are associated with magical practice that is part of aesthetic parlance among most people. Maybe not artists, but certainly people who go to museums and go to galleries. So when he says the poetry of as if replaces witchery, basically fear, the fear is no longer part of it because no one believes in magic anymore. So then it becomes subsumed into the aesthetic. And it becomes, he says, the poetry of as if. Now by as if, I think that means metaphor. That's really my feeling of what metaphor is. It's as if. Painters are always involved with as if, even the most abstract artists. They eliminate the element of fear and create a sort of a game. I thought that was really, I had heard things similar to that, but it's put in a nice little capsule there, this idea that art descends from magic through the elements of play and their connection to ritual. Now, one of the biggest differences between play and ritual, in my mind, is the element of prowess. So when you're involved in play, there's this idea about getting better, developing prowess, developing ability, setting yourself out from the run-of-the-mill player into some sort of special player who can do something that other people can't do. And that is both extends to art and also extends to other forms of play. Even if you're a teenager and you're playing some game, you notice that people are more athletic than you are. Or if you're playing chess, you notice that you're playing against somebody who actually really can play chess. And you were beating your friends, but now you're against someone who's got a rating, and he gets rid of you in about 5 minutes. And you realize, wow, I really don't know this game, against somebody who actually has prowess. Playing an instrument, same thing. You can be a good pianist or a good violinist, and then you come across, sometimes it's very, very vexing, you come across some kid who's 12 years old and he plays better than you. You don't know where that comes from, because how much could they have practiced if they're 14 years old, right? But they have, I'm just talking about the sheer physical act of playing the piano. It doesn't mean that what they're playing is really all that exciting from or profound from a musical point of view. How could it be? They're 14 years old. But, the way they get around an instrument. And, of course, the violin and any kind of instrument. And, of course, in athletics. And as a painter and as a writer, as a creative person who's really trying to bring something out of nothing, let's say, as opposed to playing someone else's music, there's still that notion of trying to develop yourself. That you're not just playing at something. It's not just fun and games. But you're trying to turn yourself into a real artist. And to get back a little bit to Milton's idea that, you're not making paintings, you're not working on paintings, you're really working on yourself. And you're using paint and painting as a means of developing yourself as an artist. That's the real goal, is to become the complete and total artist and live completely in the realm of art, for which you will probably pay some sort of social penalty for that. But that is really what his game was about, at least, not everybody's. Now, just to bring home a little bit about this idea of art and ritual. So, Claude Lévi-Strauss, he's written about this, and he made a big study, as many of you know, about the Northwest Indian tribes, the Tlingit and the Tsimshian, which is just south of the Tlingit, and the Plains Indians also. They had professional artists. The people who made totem poles were not just some Joe. There was somebody who had prowess, and they would do it. And they had position within the tribe. And in the Plains Indians, the women would do these embroideries with porcupine quills. That was what the women did. And it was abstract design. But they didn't create their own designs. There was a woman who's called a double woman who would get the revelation from the spirit world of the design. And she would do the master design. And then all the women would do it. So there was one who was the medium between the spirit world and the ordinary world, the secular world, and she would get the design. Or, if you don't believe in the spirit world, she would formulate it herself out of her head. Whether it's coming from an outside agency or not, in a sacred culture, you take it for granted. Any of you who read Black Elk Speaks, Young made a big deal about that book, which was written by an Indian chief, Black Elk, who, and this is the key to a sacred culture. He's 12 or 13 years old, and he's out with his friends on the horse, and he falls off his horse, and he's knocked unconscious, and they bring him back to the village, and he's unconscious for 3 days, and he has a fever, and his body is trembling, and water is pouring out of him, and it looks like he may even die. And after 3 days, he comes out of his body recovers. And what he's immediately asked is not, how do you feel? It's, what did you see? So all of that trembling and all of that fever was really, they thought he was in contact with spirits. That's what and he said, well, I saw the white buffalo. And they said, oh, well, you're a chief. And he became a chief at 13 years old. He was already a chief because of the vision of the white buffalo. Later, he was with Buffalo Bill Cody touring Europe, Wild West show. But, that was 40, 50 years later. That's for a sacred culture. That's a very decisive difference. Wouldn't you agree? And it's not all that different from Moses coming down from the mountain and saying that a burning bush spoke to him, and people believe him. They don't say, hey, let's get this guy some help. No, if you live in a culture like that, it's one thing to say, I speak to God, that I pray, for instance. It's quite another thing to say, God speaks to me. And if you have a friend who say, God spoke to me last night, and you live in a secular culture, even if you're a religious person, it has no different. You could be religious personally, but if you're living in a secular culture, you're going to think your friend needs some attention, some medical attention. If somebody's speaking to him, and he thinks it's God. But if you're in a sacred culture, then you're going to say the same thing that the Indians said. What did he say? Or it say, or she say, or however you envision the deity. Now, here's some things I want to close with. Well, there's 3 things really, but okay. And this has to do with, now the idea of art as work, I think really comes very much out of the Middle Ages and the guilds. You belong to a guild, you're a small contractor, and prices are set by the guild, and the work is given to you by the guild. And very often you're involved in a project that is not entirely your own. So you may do the gold leaf, and someone else may do the painting, and someone may do the heads because they're good at heads, and someone else may do the trees because they're good at trees. And it's like, there's no idea of the genius. It's really the idea of work. It's a job. And you would charge a client by the square foot, by the ped, just the way a contractor would charge you by flooring. How many feet, and then you'll get your price. How much gold leaf, how much ultramarine blue, which is the most expensive color because it's from lapis lazuli. So all that gets wrapped into the price. It's like what we did with this building. We had the cost of materials and labor and all of that. So that's the other paradigm that was much less. The problem with that paradigm is it had no real life after, I'd say, Delacroix. He was about the last person who was really making a living by taking on these big jobs like that. Once you get to the Impressionists, and even before the Impressionists, the Barbizon people, you're really talking about people who say, the hell with the big jobs, and the hell with the aristocracy, and the hell with Europe. I'm just going to go out into the countryside and paint, like Monet. Or I'm going to leave Europe altogether and go to Tahiti, like Gauguin. Or I'm going to leave Europe altogether and go to Africa, like Rimbaud, become an arms dealer or a drug dealer. That was a big thing in the 19th century. Or I'm going to take absinthe, or I'm going. That's another way of leaving Europe. You don't have to leave physically. You can leave by taking drugs and opium, smoking opium, absinthe. The idea was that Europe was so stifling, and the people that were in charge of culture were just the worst peaceful people imaginable. I mean, you just wanted no connection with them. In a funny way, this is so fascinating to me. Napoleon, not the Napoleon, but I guess Napoleon III, we're talking about the 1860s, 1870s, the emperor. He in a way started modern art, but he didn't do it consciously. They had a salon in 1863, and and all the artists in Paris bring their work. And they had openings for 2,000 paintings, because they would just hang them on the walls vertically in a huge building. But 5,000 artists wanted to show their work. So there was 2,000 that they showed, and 3,000 they said, no. And some of the people that they refused were academicians themselves. They had the certificate. This was a big scandal. It's like, who's deciding who's good and who's bad, and who's worthy of showing and who's not? So, especially if people with position were not included. So they called the emperor. And they put out paintings that were included, and they put out some paintings that were refused. And they asked the emperor to decide. And the emperor, of course, doesn't know anything about anything. And he's looking, he says, it all looks the same to me. and so they had a salon de refusés, a salon of the refused. And there was another building. I think it was some sort of agricultural building. And they put up the other 3,000 paintings. And that's where you saw the Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. That's the beginning of what we call modern art. It's from some idiotic emperor who can't tell the difference, and probably we couldn't either, for that matter. You don't know why something's refused and something's accepted. So anyway, that's an aside. But this idea of prowess, this is what I want to get to. The thing about modern art, especially modern art, starting with Picasso, the legacy that we're all living with, really, is that to people who really loved the old classical art, the craft of art, the work part of it, the part that has to do with putting your foot into someone else's footprint, fitting it. Or people can measure Donatello against Michelangelo, and can measure Carpeaux against Michelangelo. With Picasso, that starts to completely fall apart. Who are you going to measure him against? He's changed the game. The game is not the same game anymore. So what happens then is the idea of prowess becomes a bit more up in the air. And I think the earliest sign of it is Balzac's unknown masterpiece, the Fraunhofer character. That's that famous book about the unknown painter who creates an abstract painting in 1835. And it has no images at all in it. People look at it and it just looks like paint, and he thinks it's the most beautiful woman that ever existed. He thinks it's a representational painting, but everybody else sees just paint, wall of paint. It's a Balzac story, and became very famous. Cézanne said, well, that's me. I'm Fraunhofer. And Picasso acknowledged that. But the thing about it that no one ever talks about, but Balzac mentions in the beginning of the book, is that Fraunhofer is a rich man. He's got family money. He can follow his fancies. He is, in a sense, liberated from the culture. He doesn't have to paint to live. He can do what he wants. And if he thinks that a wall of paint is a beautiful woman, who's to tell him any different? See, so that's a very important idea that takes fruit not in Balzac's time, but it's related to Balzac's time, because Balzac's time is the time when people start taking drugs and absinthe and all that and trying to get away from Europe. That the poets, not so much the painters, it's the poets, who start. All those symbolists, they were all interested in liberating their brains A little bit like the 60s and psychedelic thinking. All those famous poets, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, all of those people, and a whole bunch, Mallarmé, they all did that. So here's something that I've been thinking about. There's a Greek myth. Oh, before this Greek myth, there's the Pygmalion myth, and of course, Balzac's unknown masterpiece comes from the Pygmalion idea. You know, the Pygmalion idea is that he takes ivory, the sculptor, and he turns it into the most beautiful woman, and the woman is so gorgeous and so lifelike that he prays to Athena to make it alive so he can marry it. And Athena grants his wish, and now it's a beautiful living girl, and they go off happily ever after and get married. And what Balzac does is he kind of flips that idea, and he says, well, you know, you're going to start out with a beautiful girl, which in this case is Poussin's girlfriend, who Fraunhofer uses because she's so gorgeous. And it becomes paint again. Well, instead of ivory becoming a beautiful girl through praying to the god, you're starting with the beautiful girl, and it's reverting back to the material, a wall of paint. You see, he's kind of flipping it. So, but there's another myth, which I just found out about, which is the myth of Cleisthenes and Hippocleides. And it goes like this. There's a king, Cleisthenes. He's a cruel tyrant. He has a beautiful daughter. It sounds like a lot of other stories. And he wants to marry off the daughter to the greatest athlete, the symbol of manhood in his kingdom. And Hippocleides is well-born. He's a nobleman. He's big, he's strong, he's fast. He beats everybody in every... Actually, instead of just telling you, it's better if I just read it. Okay. It's in Herodotus, by the way. Cleisthenes, the despot of Sicyon, who had offered his daughter to the suitor, who excelled in sporting events, and he wanted the best man he could find in all of Greece. All the Greeks who were proud of themselves and their cities came to ask for the lady's hand. And Cleisthenes, the father, had them contend in running and wrestling. As it happens, Hippocleides of Athens was favored, both because of his lineage and his manly worth, and he outdid all the other suitors. But then he asked the flute players to play and began to dance. And he danced marvelously indeed, making the most unexpected movements. So unexpected, in fact, that he was finally disqualified for not lacking in talent, but for being too good. Quote, "You have danced yourself out of your marriage," said Cleisthenes. And for Caffey is a philosopher, Andrea Caffey, about 100 years ago. For Caffey, James Joyce with Finnegan's Wake had disqualified himself not for lack of talent, but for being too good. And then this is most important. For exhibiting talents nobody required him to have. And I think that's something that you could think about modern art as a whole. One of the problems that people like Tworkov and Resnick and me and probably a lot of you and a lot of people we know is we've developed ourselves and we've developed talents that society has no, they lie kind of outside of what society requires us to have. We don't get the princess. We've danced ourselves out of the competition by being not bad, on the contrary, maybe too good, but how do you judge it? If there's no one doing what you're doing, how can someone say that this dance is good or bad? It's outside of the thing. So the prowess is there, but it's a prowess that is not in tune with culture's requirements. It's out of tune with the culture's requirements. And I think that's a situation we've been in really for some time. The only way to compensate for that is, of course, with advertising and with people who are going to explain art to us, for one thing. It started 50, 60 years ago with the Clement Greenbergs and people like that who are intermediaries and are going to say what's good and what's bad and who's the best and who's not the best and all of that. And also with public relations. I don't know whether you saw the Times magazine, but there's a picture of Anselm Kiefer. This is today's magazine. I was just noticing that they put all of this smoke around his head like he's the wizard of... it's not enough just to take his portrait, but you have to create a mystique, and the mystique comes from the smoke. Now, I said I was going to end with Duchamp, and I am. My feeling, and this is not from anything I've read really, it's just from my thinking about this idea of having prowess that culture can't measure. It's kind of, is that, and it comes out of that you've been playing around because you're not painting to live anymore. You're like Fenhofer. You're a rich man. You have leisure time. You're doing what you want. You're not doing something to put yourself in tune with what's required. Is that somebody's going to come along and they're going to say, this idea of Finnegan's Wake, of having poetic gifts, that creating a book that no one will read, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, Finnegan's Wake is a legendary book, and I've got a copy in my home. Probably some of you have copies. That doesn't mean we ever take it out and try to get through it, right? So that's what you end up with. A book no one will read, a painting no one... Well, looking at a painting is a little different because it only takes a second or two. You're not required to be with it for 6 months or whatever, or for giving up on page 30. Somebody's going to come along and saying, oh, especially someone with a strategic brain, and Duchamp had a strategic brain. He was a chess man. And he said, okay, so we're talking about, and he also loved classical painting, Duchamp. He really loved traditional crafted painting. So he said, what about an art that has no prowess whatsoever? Where prowess is not part of what's factored in. How about something that I just put in an emporium for art, like a urinal or a bicycle wheel or a coat rack, and say, okay, an industrial product. That would be the philosophical reverse of too much prowess that no one can recognize. You remove the whole question of what you can actually do from the equation. It's something you found, and you've managed to find a dealer or a gallerist who's willing to put it up with a price attached to it. If not, maybe not a red dot or anything, but something that is considered of value in the culture. And at the same time going like that. It is a kind of, it's a very important, I think it was inevitable that someone would say, it's kind of the answer to people like Joyce and Picasso and all, or Resnick in our time, who are exhibiting these abilities that the culture has no way of connecting to, really, other than through public relations and advertising and things, like the best, the greatest, all this stuff, it's playing on, it's a bunch of hucksters playing with the idea of epiphany, that, there's this, if you're psychologically prepared for an epiphany, then sometimes you think maybe there really is an epiphany there. Or you think, well, there's got to be one because everybody says so, and I'm just not getting it, which is my fault. It has nothing to do with the art, it's just that I'm not developed enough. I'm an undeveloped person. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, in order for the Duchampian, to work, for this whole idea of not making anything, having no prowess whatsoever, or saying it's not part of what I do, a ready-made, in other words, is that you need a dealer for that. You can't do it in your studio. You've taken the center of art from the place where you make art, and you've moved it to where you sell art. See, because if I have a bicycle wheel leaning it up against my studio wall, and you come in to visit me, and you say, oh, you have a bike? And I say, no, I don't have a bike, that's art. Your friend is going to say, well, that's a conceit. I mean, it's nice that you think so, but, let's go out to lunch, Do you have some coffee? Then it's a conceit. It's like a private conceit. That's art. But you take the same bicycle wheel and you put it in a gallery in Manhattan, then it has the mystique of being a commodity. especially if someone's actually willing to buy it. But the conceit is it already is effective even if no one buys it, just by that it's being offered as an artwork. That someone would actually buy it is the cherry on top of the ice cream. That's the quintessence, that someone did pay a couple of 100,000 or maybe even a couple of million for it. That completes the equation. You can't do it by yourself, is what I'm saying, as an artist. You must have a gallerist as part of your enterprise for that to succeed. So it takes the focus away from the studio and moves it to the marketplace. And of course, Duchamp only had one urinal, and then it got lost, and all was left was a photograph. And so I think about 40 years later, he had an edition made of the urinal, and there were, I think, a dozen of the urinals that were manufactured for the precise purpose of him being able to sell them to various museums. So there's a urinal now, and there's one in San Francisco, one in Tokyo. It's all over. They were made strictly as commodities. It's not the original urinal, which I don't think anybody can even find that anymore. Now, I've been thinking about how that relates to play, because people can really say that Duchamp is playful. I mean, if nothing else, he has a playful mentality. But he changes the game. The game is not the same game that other people are playing. I don't think that's quite emphasized sufficiently. That he was basically a conservative. I mean, posing as an avant-garde mentality. But what he really loved was the old art that was being abandoned by Picasso and people like that. And they were substituting for the craft that he really respected, an art where the craft was not easy to isolate. Because you see the way Picasso paints. I mean, it looks like this at 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock it looks like a different painting, and 4 o'clock he overhauls things. It's not that slow building process that classical art depends on, where you make sketches, you make drawings, you create your values, and color comes in at the end. It's uprooting that whole idea. You're not going A, B, C, D, E. You're going A, C, B, F, going, you can scrape a whole painting down. I do it all the time. In the 19th century, that would be unheard of. What are you doing? Anyway, so I'll take any questions.
If you consider Duchamp's last piece, it's of a whole different character than the bicycle wheel or the urinal, and that he worked on it for 20 years, and it's pretty, he is dealing with the tools of sculpture in a big way.
I'm talking about the concept of the ready-made only, yeah.
But that's not all of Duchamp.
Good point. I'm really talking about the ready-made, which is really what made him famous, influential in the art world, is the idea of the ready-made.
I would say that you'd have to consider the large glass equally to consider that.
Right, the one that broke on the delivery, and then that became part of it.
Inventive in changing tools.
But it factors in the ready-made idea, the fact that the thing smashed up, and then he said that's part of the piece. In other words, it was on delivery, it was being delivered, and the glass broke, and then that becomes part of the glass. So that becomes the.
But even the acceptance of the dust into the manufacture of it was quite fascinating. To wedge it then between two pieces of glass.
Well, he did a lot of fascinating things. I mean, Victor Pesce told me that when he was studying at NYU in 1960, he would often see Duchamp playing chess in Washington Square. And he asked his teacher about Duchamp, and he says, oh yes, well what he's doing now is he has a big heavy rope, and he ties it to the ceiling, it's hooked to the ceiling, and he drops it. He just drops it from the ceiling hook, and it falls on the floor, and he photographs it. Because what interests him is that every time it falls in a different configuration. So that becomes a subject for his art. I think he was a very interesting man, clever man. But I'm saying that the ready-made, I think, is a reaction against what Kathy was talking about.
I don't disagree with
Yeah,
that.
that's really my my proposal. Yeah.
How much does play factor into Pat puzzle work?
Well, if you look at, I mean, Pat's. My take on Pat is it's a very long career, and she went through such extraordinary changes, including ones that I certainly didn't see coming. No, I never saw. And the Pat Pasloff that I got to know was the Pat Pasloff that made Keeping Still Mountain, which she had up in her apartment for 8 or 9 years. I never would have dreamed that she would make the paintings downstairs. So she is kind of, her career is so long that in a certain respect, it's hard to imagine it not happening. A lot of the artists that we associate with the movement that she came out of died when they were comparatively, I wouldn't call them young men, but middle-aged men. You know, Franz Klein died in like 1962. David Smith was in an accident. Pollock was in an accident. Gorky hung himself. You can go down the list, Bradley Walker Tomlin. And even people like Rothko and Newman, were by 1970, they were gone. And, you know, Pat painted for 65 years. Most of those men didn't even live 65 years, or they barely got there. And she painted that long, because that's what happens when you live to be 83, 84. You end up with, so they ended up, most of those people that I'm talking about, they ended up with a signature style, which some of them were very intent on. Rothko was very conscious of that, by the way. You know, I was reading an essay on Anne Ryan. Do you know who Anne Ryan is, everybody? She's a collage, she's got like at least half a dozen collages in the Met. And she was much older than these people. She was born in 1884 or something, and she died in 1954. And Mark Rothko really liked what she was doing, and he sent down, he didn't come himself, but he sent Barney Newman and Tony Smith to see her. And Barney Newman said to Anne Ryan, Rothko wants you to know that he feels you should develop a recognizable signature so that people can see what an Anne Ryan is, which is, of course, what Rothko had done. And Anne Ryan, God bless her, you know, she turned to I think it was Barnett Newman who said that. She said, "Who the fuck do you think you are?" But of course, she was, you know, she was old enough to be Barnett Newman's mom. She was born in 1885 or something like that. You know, because he was born at least 20 years later than that. But she thought it was very, very nervy. But you can see that impulse was very strong starting in the 50s and then especially in the 60s and all that and that's what Jack Tworkov, when I opened this talk, that's what I'm talking about. You know, he's in conflict. He's got this inner conflict between producing Tworkovs, which he said in 1950s, he's quoted as saying, "I don't want to make Tworkovs," and then he goes and he says, "I'm making Tworkovs."
So are you saying that, in a sense, his wife is a player?
Huh?
Pat is a player?
Well, yes, I think she's involved in play, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Milton, too. I mean, Milton's last 20 years when he's working with these little figures and little insignias, there's no way to have seen that coming. But you know, and he said, well, a lot of it, I couldn't work the way I was working before because I didn't have the physical ability to do it. So if I'm going to look at a little painting in front of me or a piece of paper, then this whole idea of using my peripheral vision doesn't come into play. When you're working something this big, it's right in front of you. There's no peripheral vision involved. So you're back to composing. You know. So he felt that to some extent this is what he was capable of, and he was very philosophical about it. He would adapt the way he thought about art to his circumstances. He used to talk, when I first met him, he would talk to me about, we painted all these big paintings, we need to paint small now. This is before he bought this building. And about a year or two later, we're sitting here, back there he had this huge sofa there. Of course, the staircase wasn't there, the elevator wasn't, it was way open. And we're sitting there, and he says, so how's your work coming, Jeff? And I said, well, I've been working, relatively small. And he says, oh, watercolors. Well, a year earlier, he's talking about cultivating small paintings, and he had completely, because now he had this big space, you see. Now we're back to using what did he get this space for? Not to make small things, you see. So, but about things that really mattered to him, he was very, very, you couldn't move him on certain aspects of art. I mean, it was just, he was fervent about it, which he was like Old Testament fervent about certain aspects of painting, which was very, very appealing, and to see that someone feels so strongly about something, especially if you're young and you don't have strong feelings necessarily about anything. You're taking it all in. You're going to museums, going to galleries, you're seeing the art world that exists, and to come across somebody who feels so strongly that this is the way things must be. And then it becomes a shock when 25 years later, they are switching. They've played that part out. Their circumstances have changed. So if you buy a big studio like this, your circumstances have changed. If you find that your back and legs are so bad that you can't stand on a ladder to paint anymore, your circumstances have changed. And your work will change. And that's part of life. And the material you work with determines a great deal about what will happen. If you're a real artist, you're confronting yourself with the material, whatever material it might be, whether it's wax, plaster, or whether it's granite or paint or whatever. They only do certain things. They don't do everything. You have to find out what the material does and adapt yourself to it. Yeah?
Thank you for this opening talk. I'm a playwright, so I'm always grappling with the idea of play and work.
Yeah. Right.
This is very fascinating. Thank you. And I was just wondering about talking about, I guess, between career and hobbies, purpose. I was wondering with a Pat, going back to Pat, of course, being a woman in that time, how that informed her grappling with these issues.
Well, I think Pat wanted a career, but I don't think she was a hustler. It wasn't part of her. She was a kind of an aristocrat. And an aristocrat, I don't mean an aristocrat, but I mean she wanted it to come to her. She wasn't going to go around and peddle her work and try and get shows. The idea was, I'm Pat Pasloff, they should come to me. But of course, that you pay a penalty for that, because usually they're not going to come to you. So she had that. And she was part of that generation of Joan Mitchell and Elaine de Kooning who didn't think of themselves as women artists. They didn't think they were women artists. They thought they were artists. And they wanted to be with the guys. They wanted to laugh with the guys and drink with the guys and be part of the merry band that was down there on 8th Street. They didn't want to show in women's shows. Now I don't think there's any choice. But back then, they really wanted to be the female equivalent of a male painter on its own terms. That's what they wanted. This was before feminism. Yeah.
A couple of nights ago, I was listening on Democracy Now! To Louise Godbold, who started this foundation called ECHO, based in LA, and she's one of the women who were part of the Me Too movement, especially having been harassed by Harvey Weinstein. So I Googled her afterwards, and there's something very interesting about ECHO. Louise Godbold, who I think was originally came to this country 25 years ago from Sweden, I think.
Did she come here to be an actress?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm just trying to...
She's an actress and a director.
Okay, go ahead.
And she's very interesting. And she said that, wrote something about the three different parts of the brain, the oldest part being about survival, a middle part more about language, emotions, and magic and religion and art. And the newest frontal part of the brain, most recent part of the brain, being used more for strategy, and abstract thinking. And it seems to me that what's happened, especially recently, and this is what she feels has happened in our society, particularly here, that we've just combined the oldest part of the brain, which works for survival, and then left over the part that has to do with religion, language, emotions, to strategy and abstract thinking and corporatism. And it makes sense.
To some extent, I think it does. I guess I think that the oldest, the reptilian, the survival part, is connected to religion and to sciences and technology. It's related, it's at the foundation of all culture, really, is this idea of immortality and living longer. And if you can get that through religion, by imagining that death is not final and that you have another life afterwards, or if you can get it through technology, like this idea that maybe stem cells can reproduce your heart and reproduce your liver, is also this idea of immortality. Are you going to get it through science, or are you going to get it through prayer, or are you going to get it through art, through posterity? So you will die, but people 100 years from now will know your name because they are looking at your painting or your sculpture. So art has its own answer to immortality. All human endeavor, all culture, has to do with artificially extending people's existence. I'm not mean necessarily consciously. I'm not saying that you become an artist because you want to live forever. But I think most people my age, and your age, when we get to 70 or near 70, we start, and we have hundreds of paintings or whatever, we start thinking about legacy, which we never really did before. What's going to happen to all these paintings? Oh, shit, I don't even have any kids I can give them to. If I haven't established commodity, if I am not being bought and sold in the marketplace, is it going to end up in a dumpster? Because there's no middle ground. There's no middle ground unless what we're trying to do here with this foundation is give Milton and Pat a second life. We don't want it to end up in a dumpster. But it's the storage facility that is for Pat and Milton together is, $70,000 annually. And the trustees are all people who knew them. What happens when we're gone? I'm going to be 70 in August. How many of us are going to be around in 20 years? So then what happens to these people?
Nobody's going to be around, it looks like.
Well,
In another 50 years. Why worry?
well, there's no way I'm going to be around in 50 years. I was just saying 15, not 50. The idea of legacy and immortality has its answer in art as well as its answer in medicine and in religion. There's who's that very famous Spanish existentialist? Unamuno. He wrote about this peasant woman, and he was Spanish, and he was talking about prayer. And he said, he saw her praying, and afterwards he asked her, if there was no afterlife, would you pray? She looked at him like he was crazy. She said, well, of course not. What would be the point? Every religion has its own answer to the fact that your death is an illusion, that you're going to go on somehow. Maybe reincarnated, maybe transmigration, maybe heaven, maybe hell. But there's going to be another form of you somehow, that your energy can't just end. And then, of course, there's this whole idea of theodicy, which is the idea that the bad people who've been afflicting you, the Donald Trumps, are going to get their just desserts. And if it's not in this world, they're going to get their just desserts after their death. And people want that too. They want to feel that there is some sort of final justice. That's part of religion also. I was really more addressing the magic part of religion, which is really the ritual element. It's really the transubstantiation, the wafer and the wine, that moment where it's literally the body and blood, which Catholics are taught. And this, I'm going to stop. This is great. So Flannery O'Connor, you all know her. Great short story writer. Lived down south, ardent Catholic. Wrote for the New Yorker, among other places. And she would come up periodically to see her editors, and there would always be a literary party. And she'd go to these literary parties. And at one of these parties, she's seated next to Mary McCarthy, who probably was raised Catholic too, I would imagine, but was like an ardent Trotskyist. And of course, an incredibly intelligent woman. And they get talking about the way for transubstantiation. And Mary McCarthy says to Flannery O'Connor, well, of course, you accept the idea that this is a symbolic act. And Flannery O'Connor says, if I thought that, I wouldn't have anything to do with it. Of course, it actually, she believed that it's the way, at the moment, with the incantation and with the way it's done, that it's the technique that makes that transformation. It's what accompanies it. That's the magic of it, is precisely the ritual aspect of it. So if you have someone who, let's say, cuts their fingernails and then burns their, in Africa, let's say, who when their fingernails get long and their toenails, they cut them and then they burn them. And an ethnologist from England said, why do you do that? And he said, because if my enemies get a hold of it, they can kill me by destroying the things. And then it's a complete misunderstanding of magic. And the French said, look, if it was the question of destroying the fingernails and toenails, then he would be hurting himself when he himself burnt them. So it wasn't the burning it wasn't that. It was, if my enemies get a hold of the toenails and fingernails with the proper words and the proper incantation and the proper odors and whatever ceremony that they can destroy me. So it wasn't the fingernails, it was the ritual itself that was going to do it in the hands of their enemies. So it's better to burn them now. And that's
That's what voodoo is all about, and the rituality.
yeah, well, voodoo is sculpture, isn't it? But it's magical sculpture, but you're creating an image of someone. And if you put the pins in and it doesn't work, maybe you didn't do such a good job with the sculpture, maybe it should be a little, that, you can see the idea of prowess is inherent in that idea, that if your magic isn't working, maybe you should get a pro to do it.
I mean, this is the story of Western minds. Okay? Religion, is magic, is feeding of death, escaping from death. But paintings start out stating themselves as illusions. You start with them as illusions. You know we're looking at an illusion, and you're seeing what fun to be had with this illusion. Where can they go? Mm-hmm. What can illusion offer you?
Well, the modern art idea is to try and remove the illusion. So the traditional idea of art is that you're creating the illusion of a picture window. So for most people, art meant that you could, and in movies now, in most commercial movies, the idea is to give you the illusion that you can walk into that space. You can walk into that painting and can even pat Jesus on the shoulder, and then you can turn around and wave to yourself, and say, look, there's room here. And modern art revolts against that idea.
Modern art, I'm saying, it presents itself as illusion.
I'm saying it's resisting illusion.
No, I'm saying it states itself as illusion. All these paintings right now are flat paintings. They say I'm flat, but you can begin to look into them dimensionally.
Right, but you can't project your body into them. That's really what I'm saying. There's no room.
Projecting your mind in.
Yes, well, you project your mind into literature also.
Right.
Any cultural aspect, you're going to invest your mind. But what modern art does, starting really with Cézanne, is it prevents you from imagining you can walk into the picture. So Cézanne is not flat. Cézanne has a great deal of, I guess I would call it spatiality, but it doesn't have room. No one imagines that they can walk into a Cézanne. But if you look at a Velázquez or you look at a de la Tour, then that creates the sensation that it's a window. They get rid of the window. Cézanne replaces it with a panel. It's basically a panel with paint on it that has sculptural aspects to it, but
It's a playground for the mind. We call plays play.
yeah,
And you don't walk into the play, you watch the play. No matter what happens, you watch the Pygmalion.
that's right. A classical play.
You don't have to live with the expectation of moving into the game physically.
Right.
It's a play thing.
Yeah, but with different rules. There's a different rules for narrative than there is for painting. So if you're looking at a play or you're looking at a film, it's an unraveling, an unwinding in time. That's the game. It gives you the illusion of unraveling in time, even if it... Whereas painting presents you with that nothing more is going to happen. What is going to happen has already happened. I mean, that's the nature of a static image. We've had this discussion before. I mean, it's a different game, so you can say, okay, there's different kinds of illusions depending on the kind of game that you're playing. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm just saying that it is a form of play. Yeah, it's not. And when it starts to feel like work, I think you're in trouble. I think Jack Porco was in trouble. And I think it was just interesting that as his student, he didn't communicate any of that. His ambivalence about what he was teaching us was not communicated to us. His inner journals show that he had ambivalent feelings about this idea of producing, and yet that's what he was teaching us because he felt that he was being a responsible professor. Yeah, it's time to go. So that's it. This is great. Thank you so much. Thank you.